What is up, everyone? Coming at you with a quick video this Saturday to talk about this Polyfill vulnerability. First of all, how to detect it and respond to it, and then just some thoughts about what it means for security more generally. But let's just start with some examples and understanding what this is. So, when you have HTML, and I'm going to try to be pretty basic here because this stuff gets complicated really fast, like all coding stuff does. But in the head, I have just added as an example of what this might look like a script with the source pointing to cdn.polyfill.io and then pointing to a specific script that they're hosting. So I don't have too many other good examples on this site, but it's very common to instrument JavaScript like this. If you're just starting a project, if it's a smaller project, this is very common with like Bootstrap, for example, where you point it to their CDN and you trust that they're not doing anything malicious. And because of that, you're essentially pulling in their code to make it so that things like tagging classes work. And so people import these different scripts to make different things work. So in the case of Polyfill, this is just a quick diagram to get an idea of what people used it for. The first is just, it got popular about 10 years ago as a way to backport new browser features. So this is an example of can I use, and it tells you which versions of things are supported, right? So a common thing is to do a media query to get the resolution of the device that you're on. This was not supported in older versions of IE back in 2009. This is also before NPM became popular. And so early in these days, right, you would want to use this because it's a great way to do screen sizing. All of these browsers supported it, but you probably also had to support older versions of IE. And so let's say you want to use that tag, you would then have the user agent is sending, and this string's a lot longer, but I just cut it off here for readability, where the user agent is indicating that this is on Internet Explorer. The user agent here is indicating the person's on Chrome. And if they're on Internet Explorer, then the Polyfill JavaScript sees that they're on the old user agent, and they instead of actually looking for the media query, they use custom JavaScript to replicate the functionality as though the browser supported it. So it was a very elegant way to make it so you could just code with the media query, for example, in this case, and just fill in those features on the older versions of browsers. So very popular, very easy to use, smart way to do it. And so that's why a lot of people would have done this CDN source, because over time, people started doing NPM installs, and the Sneak blog had some good examples of within dependencies. So some dependencies were using the CDN under the hood, and some of them weren't. And so depending on which package you were importing, it might be using the CDN under the hood. It really gets difficult to tell. But if you were directly just importing Polyfill as a library from the source, you were totally safe because the repository didn't get taken over. Instead, it was just this domain that got taken over by a malicious actor. So this is really what you're looking for, is this CDN. So at a high level, there's a few things to check. The easiest thing is just if you're referencing it this way. It gets a little more complicated if you're importing a lot of your own JavaScript, because then you would also have to search those files for the CDN. Let's take a look at this attack real quick before we look in how you search for it. So the user goes to your website, they get the front end stuff. It tells them to go to polyfill.io to download some additional JavaScript. This domain is what actually got taken over. And so if instead you had just included this JavaScript into your application, there actually wouldn't be an attack because the JavaScript itself was safe. It was this domain that got taken over, and attackers put malicious code into it, which then would get sent to you and then tell you it's still being uncovered, some of the different stuff they were doing. But one thing we know they were doing was hosting malicious website under this Googie analytics with the slight changes. That way it would look unsuspicious if someone was just looking at it. So it was a pretty complicated attack where the JavaScript coming from here was obfuscated pretty heavily and was telling them to go at least to this, but it's still being investigated what they were doing. So this attack, first of all, is not like ongoing because Namecheap's shut down the domain here. And so this actually, like right now, even if you had Polyfill, it wouldn't work, which most people don't need it anymore because the browser issue here is done. Like no one's trying to use IE8 anymore to view your website, hopefully. And so most people wouldn't even notice. And so this is really like Namecheap saved the day on this one by shutting down and being responsive to this DNS. What's scary is if the DNS provider had changed to one that's less responsive to this kind of stuff, then it would be a very live issue. So this makes it so that when we talk about how to search, how to mitigate, there's really not like an ongoing threat. It's more just to make sure that if this domain comes back online, as well as some of these other domains that have been confirmed to be used by the attacker. If any of those come back online, we just want a way that we can respond to it. So let's go into how would we detect this? So this is really funny to me because there's this general idea that like DAST is dead has become popular to say. But because of the nature of this, SCA scanning wouldn't normally detect it because it's just looking for this string. This isn't a CVE. It's not a CVE published against a known package. So it sort of breaks the logic of SCA scanners, which is sort of how we think about finding supply chain vulnerabilities. So in the course of doing this, I tested like how to respond via Semgrep, Aikido, Zap, Nuclei, and Zap was by far the easiest from a DAS standpoint. And so all I had to do here, and this is on their Zap site here, how to do this, which I can link below. It's just a one-line Docker run. So you just have Docker set up and you just run it and point it at a website. Right now I'm pointing it at my staging environment where I just push this code. So I run it. And that was it. We already see in the response right away, scripts are from malicious domain Polyfill, and it tells us that it's there. They also have a low alert that will come up that I didn't go down this route because I didn't make my own custom JavaScript. But if I was referencing in any of my JavaScript files, if it referenced going to this domain, this scan would have also detected it just as a low, as instead of a high, where it knows that it's actually serving the script or attempting to fetch it. So that Zap scan was just the easiest way to do it. But just to show you sort of how this gets messy, like Semgrep created a rule, but I think their code search is still like in beta because I have to contact sales. I tried to add like my organization, which worked, my Latio Tech one, but then it doesn't show up here. I don't know why. And then Aikido is pretty easy to start free and just hook a repo up to. And they just use Semgrep under the hood. And so they have created their own SaaS rule here at the top of the list as a critical to find links to these known malicious domains. So I just wanted to show this because it's an example of why webhook scanning is so important. Because even if I had something like Semgrep, but I could only run it locally, like some of these older SCA tools, which Semgrep has webhooks now. I just don't have the full version to make this work. But pretend I was using something like Black Duck, and I had the idea for then would be to clone every single repository down and run a giant scan against the entire repo base, which would take super long, be super inefficient, be super weird to do. And so that's why I like stuff like this. That's webhook scanning, where I can just plug in my repo, run a scan on demand when I want it. Then it scans and tells me if I'm vulnerable or not. So I just find that methodology to be a lot simpler. The final thing to do here to look for it, which is obviously the easiest way as well, is to just search for Polyfill, and then we can see that the search comes up here. Same thing in GitHub. If I just search for Polyfill and change it to code, it shows up here in the pull request. Since it's just in a branch, it's not going to find it via the code search here, but you can easily search across your entire code base with GitHub or GitLab. Both have searches for that. So those are the easiest ways to detect if you're vulnerable and to figure out what to do. So real quick, now that I know where this is, it's super easy to fix it. I just change it to the Cloudflare mirror of this. There's also a Fastly mirror if you prefer that for some reason. But just changing it to the safe Cloudflare mirror is the easiest way to just stop it and rip and replace right away. And then over time, the creator recommends deleting Polyfill entirely because you don't really need it. Unless you have very, very weird edge cases where super old unsupported browsers are something you need to care about, in which case, I'm sorry. So some high level takeaways here from this that I think are really interesting. The first is just the role of like influencers in the cybersecurity arena is so weird because this got a lot of buzz around it because of like JavaScript content creators that are out there on YouTube who brought a lot of attention to it. But otherwise, I don't know how much the community would even be involved with it. Even the Reddit post on it was like very minimal activity. Like supply chain security is in a weird place where like this should be broadcasted like very heavily. But on the other hand, since Namecheap took down the domain, like there's not an active threat where this really spirals out of control. So I think a lot of people can kind of miss that this even happened because there's no active threat. Sort of it got taken care of upstream. But what's interesting is we were also warned about this stuff in February. So like there was this LinkedIn post that has like no, like very little engagement on it from back in February saying to stop using it. There was a Cloudflare that they linked to, but it was ironic because they were still using this domain on their status page. And so it just speaks to the difficulty of trying to like clean it up across your uh, ecosystem. And then there's this post from the maintainer from back in February as well. And so I think this speaks to more than like having an S-bomb. This is why I talk about Tidelift nonstop, is because uh, having an S-bomb by itself does not solve anything. The only thing that solves it is having a relationship with maintainers to where when this guy starts saying, in theory, uh, hey, there's this potential security issue that could happen, make sure you fix this, that he actually has like some relationship with you where this third party can tell you like, hey, make sure you go do this. The maintainer said, we know you use this, and the maintainer warned you that some change needs to happen. The second thing is that there's nothing, since this was a client-side attack, most fixes wouldn't actually have done anything at runtime to prevent it because it would need to be like a browser extension or something similar on the user side to fix it. We keep saying DAST is dead, and yet DAST is the easiest way to detect this and to look for it. That doesn't apply universally. I agree that there are many problems with DAST, but it's a good example of why we can't just say scanning your actual website at runtime from the front end just doesn't matter at all. I think there's a lot of examples of bad DAST, but modern ones, like I always talk about Escape and Stackhawk as my two examples because they don't just do boring DAST web crawls, but they actually interrogate the JavaScript, have meaningful understandings of the underlying API architecture, and can do full fuzzing of things. But I mean, even Zap, right? Like, because a lot of Stackhawk is based on Zap, and just any DAST solution, it's important to know how to use it and to have one that you can run a scan. No matter what it is. Second, a lot of the vendor blogs on this one are giving weird mitigations because they don't actually support fixing it. So I've seen a lot of people say, like, use a content security policy, and that, like, all a content security policy does is explicitly declare where JavaScript can load from. So this wouldn't have helped because you would have already had Polyfill as a trusted source, most likely. Now, theoretically, it could stop that JavaScript from then trying to interact with other JavaScript with other sites. But it's very theoretical where like maybe it would help with this weird edge case, but in general, it wouldn't have prevented the attack. Same with like a lot of the scanner companies because they've been focused on SCA scanning. They really don't have mitigation because this isn't an SCA scan kind of issue. What they're having to do is go through every package that they notice is vulnerable and manually flag it in their system as having an alert. And so it's just not a fast response time. And then the SaaS scanners are the ones that can have the best response, but it's because they're looking for it just directly in the code. And all of this is why I continue to think that tools that combine this functionality into a single place really have the best chance of succeeding, because something like a DAS scanner is really good in this case, but for XZutils, it wouldn't have helped. And for XZutils, SCA wouldn't have helped. You needed container vulnerability scanning. And for Log4j, you needed SCA scanning. And so all three kinds of scanning for three different supply chain attacks are the only things that would help with it. So this is why I think it's really important to understand this idea of this 8-in-1 kind of scanner and how each one of these things plays a role in detecting and responding to an actual 0-day that comes up. In sum, let's pay maintainers. Let's be cool. Thanks for watching.